Hi, so you're looking to do an extension and you've heard that you can do things under what is known as permitted development, but you're not quite sure what that involves and what you're allowed to do without requiring sort of formal planning permission. This video is going to talk a little bit about the difference between permitted development and planning and when things might get a little bit confusing or where you could go wrong with it. It's really important if you're going down the permitted development route that you actually make sure that you are complying with permitted development rules. So let's start by understanding what is permitted development. Permitted development is a bit of national legislation that effectively says you can do certain things, and I'm going to talk just in the context of houses at the moment, certain things to your house without needing planning permission. Now, those certain things come with a lot of caveat, and that's the thing to be really careful about. So, for example, if you're doing a loft conversion, you may well not be able to do an extension to the back of that house if it was in a conservation area. There'll be restrictions in place that you want to make sure that you're not falling foul of. Some local authorities put blanket bans on extensions under permitted development, and you just want to make sure you're not living with one of those. So the key here is, if you need to go down the permitted development route, it doesn't mean to say you don't need an architect. It's actually probably more useful that you do, so you don't fall foul of the rules. Because if you fall foul of the rules, not only do they take away your permitted development rights, it may be that you can't get planning permission with the council for what you're looking to do. So on a small single-storey extension, you are allowed up to 3 meters on a terrace property and up to 4 meters on a detached property. What seems like quite a lot. Then they put caveats in about how high it can be, what height it can be near the boundaries, what height it can be at the end of the extension. You want to make sure you get that right. It is really easy to get it wrong, and trying to fix it is difficult. Similarly, local authorities might allow you deeper extensions under normal planning. So it's understanding what do you want to do and where. If you're looking to do a L-shaped single-storey rear extension and on the side, then you might find that permitted development isn't for you because it doesn't allow you to do that. But under full planning, you might be able to do that without much of a risk at a sort of single-storey stage. There are lots of nuances, and it's quite tricky to explain that in a short video. But the key here is that permitted developments is national legislation, and normal planning or full planning would sit under local authority sort of review. If you want to be sure whether or not your scheme complies with permitted development, we would always recommend making an application for a certificate of lawfulness. This involves getting some drawings done, showing what you're trying to do, and then submitting that to the council so that you get a certificate to say that what you are doing actually does comply with permitted development legislation. There are a couple of areas where people often fall foul of permitted development. Permitted development does not apply to flats. That's the first thing. So if you live in a converted house that's been converted into flats, despite what you might think, you do not have any permitted development rights for anything on the ground floor, first floor, or even at loft level. You will need planning permission for any changes to that flat. That's one place where people often fall foul. The other place is making things bigger than they're actually allowed. So, for example, under permitted development, in most areas, you can put an outbuilding in the garden. Really handy these days when people want a home office. If it is even a couple of centimeters taller than what is allowed, you could be in trouble, and the local authority can ask you to bring it down. Particularly if somebody has reported it, if they're offended by it in any way, because don't forget, under permitted development, your neighbours aren't consulted. So if you're not having sort of those neighbourly conversations with your neighbours, then at times they may be feeling aggrieved and they may report it, and then the council gets involved with enforcement action because you've made your outbuilding a couple of centimetres taller than it should be. Similar sort of principles apply to roofs and roof extensions under permitted development. There are very strict criteria of how big your dormers can be, or how big any extensions on the roof can be, and where they can extend out to relative to the rear boundaries, the front of the property, and the side. And if you fall foul of those, again, there are instances where councils will take enforcement action and ask you to bring it down, or subsequently make a planning application, which they may well refuse if it doesn't comply with their own policy. The other tricky bit about permitted development and planning permission, the two things can often be completely contradictory. So, for example, under permitted development, to some properties, you may well be able to do two-story rear extension, and there are lots of caveats on heights and settings from boundaries and things like that for two-story extensions. Some councils may not allow full-width two-story extensions, and so you could be thinking, well, how can I do this under permitted development but not under full planning? And the key here is to use advantages in the permitted development system that work in your favour relative to the space that you're looking to create versus what the planners may or may not allow if they are determining it based on their local policy. So there can often be contradictions, and it can get incredibly confusing and incredibly complex, particularly if you are trying to maximize the volumes that are allowed, as particularly at loft level. And it's not just at loft level. If you are doing a two-story extension, that roof extension will also count under your volume allowance. And similarly, if you've already got extended portions at two-story that abut to your roof, they will also be taken away from your roof allowance. And so calculating what you can and can't do can often be quite complex. So it's not something that you should just leave to chance unless it is very, very bog standard. And hence why we always recommend making an application for a certificate of lawfulness under permitted development, so that you will make sure what you are proposing is above board, and therefore you've taken all the precautions that you can to make sure prior to starting the works that it is compliant with permitted development. Permitted development does not stop you from being creative. In fact, it can open up many things that allow you to be creative. But again, if you're changing materials on it, typically there is a restriction that all materials must match existing. So, for example, if you want to suddenly change your red tiled roof to something that looks like zinc on the outside with your dormer extension, that may not be permitted development, although the form may be. And there are ways to get around that, but it's just being careful that you don't fall foul of it there. So that's a little brief snapshot of where people might fall foul of permitted development, what potentially you can have with it, and how you can go forward with it. But as I say, make sure you get your certificate of lawful illness in place, and hopefully a local architect can help you with that.